Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one from a classic science fiction author, and it is a book about falling asleep for 200 years and socialist revolutions. I am referring to The Sleeper Awakes by H.G. Wells, which was published in 1899. For those who don't know, and I have a feeling a lot of people know who H.G. Wells is, but for those who don't, H.G. Wells, or Herbert Wells, was an English author who lived between the mid-1800s and the mid-1900s. He's mostly known for being one of the big head cheeses of science fiction writing. He was a futurist, and he frequently wrote about time travel and, alien invasions, which you see in the War of the Worlds, a pretty solid book worth reading, and with a number of other books and short stories that he's written. And he was also an avowed socialist, and warned about, fascism and all kinds of things of that nature. Some of which those themes pop up in The Sleeper Awakes here. I'd be very interested in rereading some of his other works that I've checked out, because I wonder if the idea of fascism or socialism pops up there too, and I just wasn't really paying attention. A very big deal in literature circles. He's considered one of the originators of science fiction, at least as we know it, coming up with a lot of the basis that people built off of. And then you have the next generation of Isaac Asimov and Philip K. Dick, and then the people who came after them. H.G. Wells is at least in white culture, Western culture, he's seen as the be all end all there. But without further ado, let's talk about The Sleeper Awakes. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Sleeper Awakes focuses on the character of Graham. He is a Victorian British man at the turn of the century. He is dealing with insomnia at the start of the story, talking to a stranger about it, and noting that he's not really willing to take drugs to fix the problem. But luckily that problem is fixed for him, as he just falls into a catatonic state and it ends up in a deep sleep for the next 200 or so years. And while that is happening, his money, that is slowly growing and growing and growing, is put into a trust. And that trust forms a council who sort of leads humanity in that 200 years, growing more corrupt as time goes on. Eventually, Graham wakes up 200 years later, and people were not expecting that. The world has, or at least the world of the United Kingdom, has fractured into two different groups: the council, who are very fascist and authoritarian, and the revolutionaries, who are more socialist and speak for the working people. At least that's what their leader Ostrog says. Graham is initially taken by the council, who seem to want to kill him because he's asking too many questions, but he's saved by the revolutionaries. And he's brought before Ostrog, who tells him about his grand revolution that is going to take place and free the people. Of course, he runs into another person who tells him that Ostrog was trying to become part of the council. And when they rejected him, then he chose to lead this people's revolution. Although whether or not that's actually true remains to be seen. But there's a giant battle, and this takes place all over the world, as the entire world is infused with this sort of socialist revolution. But eventually, after a pretty big battle, the council surrenders, and it appears that Ostrog and his people have won. Ostrog keeps Graham as the puppet sort of ruler, while Ostrog rules, and the and the shadows suggesting that you're still having a bit of a monarchy take place. But Graham is so well regarded and viewed as the master of the world, the sleeper, a messiah figure, that people don't really seem to mind. And while Ostrog leads, Graham joins society. He sees how things are going. We see a lot of him doing a lot of touristy kind of things, just checking out what the world is like. He develops a love for flying, becoming an aeronaut, which is pretty bold prediction on H.G. Wells' part, if I'm going to admit that, that more people would be flying, even though he kind of wrote this at the turn of the century. It was becoming more popular, of course. But he also develops a complacency, Graham, in that he's not really questioning whether the socialist revolution actually worked. And he meets with a person named Helen who, asks him that question. She notes that Ostrog has no intention of doing anything more, especially for the lower class people. And this really was only a revolution for those who had means, like just a changing of the keys to the house, or so it seems. And he actually confronts Ostrog about this, who pretty much confirms it, noting that the world is always teetering towards monarchy, and they might throw Ostrog out of power, but some other monarch or like fascist or monarchical figure is going to take his place, and it's just going to keep on going until you end up with another aristocracy, which is extremely pessimistic to say. And indeed, Graham, goes and checks out the lower classes and finds that things are very difficult for them, and so he seeks to try to find a way to do better. But when he confronts Ostrog about this, and especially notes how Ostrog has betrayed him by calling out outside police to stifle another revolution, Ostrog says he was wrong to come back to the headquarters and tries to have him jailed. But luckily, another uprising takes place. The people free Graham, and he realizes that Ostrog has flown away, but will come back with more forces. And when they do, Graham realizes the only thing he can do is attack them from the air. There's a massive dogfight, and Graham manages to take down quite a few people. Unfortunately, as he's dogfighting Ostrog's plane, his plane is hit pretty hard, and as the story comes to a close, he is falling towards the earth, wondering if the revolution is ever going to be successful. And that's where it ends. In terms of analysis, there is a little bit worth talking about with The Sleeper Awakes. Very fascinating story that has some good and a little bit bad. Some stuff that doesn't quite hold up. But there's still some things that I'm surprised that H.G. Wells was talking about, even back in 1899, that I think merit some attention. One of the things he was talking about is the idea of the human oddity, the out of place human, the relic from the past. Graham is an oddity in the future. Everyone views him as a sort of messiah figure, or they're willing to use him or his image to prop up that idea of the messiah figure. And again, he's a relic from the past. Everyone keeps remarking how things were different in his day, but now they're not so positive. Although saying that things were great in 1899, a time when disease was still rampant, like it is today, or like when there was so much inequality during that time, even more so than today. I don't quite agree with H.G. Wells, trying to prop that up. But, it's the time that you live in, and I guess you're going to say that it's pretty great. At least it was for H.G. Wells. But again, Graham is viewed as this messiah figure. Everywhere he goes, people if they see him, there's an uproar. Everyone wants to see him, to view this mythical sleeper, who the council had talked about and said was going to return one day and finish the sort of people's revolution that took place. But that doesn't seem to be something that the council actually wanted. It was just a way to subjugate the people. But he was used in that way as a messiah figure, and the people eventually started to believe it. And even when, in the story, what's interesting is, Ostrog is viewed as not really finishing the revolution. The people don't blame Graham for this, even though he's the puppet leader. They say, "Oh, the sleeper has been betrayed," or something like that. There's an assertion that the sleeper can do no wrong, even though Graham is a simple man, but the people don't see him like that. What's also interesting is that there's this comparison to King Arthur. King Arthur being a big deal in the British mythology, sort of foundational myth. And what's also interesting is if you know your King Arthur lore, which not a lot of people do. King Arthur is believed to be, or he'll have a messianic return, like Jesus of a sort. That's also the case for a number of other cultural figures throughout the world, but for he's compared to King Arthur. So again, there's that idea of the Messiah figure coming back and finally bringing justice and fairness to the world. So that's a lot for Graham to have to deal with in this story, and it seems like there's no real potential for normalcy for Graham. Like he's kind of stuck out of place in this world, sort of given a large responsibility that he might not be able to fulfill, and he kind of has to deal with that. Sure, he's given everything he wants because he has a lot of money, but he also has to bear the responsibility of being this prophesized savior of humanity. And I don't think he can quite live up to that. So I like the complexity that Wells is writing here with Graham. Another huge chunk of this story is focused on the idea of the socialist revolution. Wells shows that the people yearn for revolution. That was also believed in Wells' own time. Like you had Karl Marx saying, the proletariat will rise up and take control over the bourgeoisie, and everything will be pretty great. And you see that in this story because that's what Ostrog argues that the people want. He promises social improvement. He promises to take down the corrupt and bourgeoisie council that is using the trust, the money of Graham's for nefarious purposes in order to subjugate the people. So you have Ostrog as this working class hero, or what he prefers to show everyone as this working class hero that Marx and other philosophers at the time argued might pop up. But it's also clear that that's not what Ostrog is going to be. He just simply wants power, and he's willing to use the image of Graham, the image of the sleeper, in order to facilitate that, to get his revolution going. He doesn't want to simply remove the council. He just wants to be on the council and have that power. You always got to beware those people who don't want change. They just want change for their own world. Rather than the entire world. Like, I don't care if other people are happy, but I want to be the most happy, which is not what you really look for in someone who's supposed to lead or whatnot. There is another interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this. "But there has been a revolution," he said. "All these things will be changed. Ostrog, that is our hope. That is the hope of the world, but Ostrog will not do it. He is a politician. To him it seems things must be like this. He does not mind. He takes it for granted. All the rich, all the influential, all who are happy, come at last to take these miseries for granted. They use the people in their politics. They live in ease by their degradation. But you who come from a happier age, it is to you the people look, to you." And that is a very interesting quote that Graham is talking to Helen in the story, a person he becomes pretty close to. And she just acknowledges, Ostrog is a politician. He doesn't really want what's better for the people. He takes the miseries for granted. He just assumes that that's how things have to be. The people thresher, the people thresher has to be there, surely, because if we take it away, there's no more people threshing, and what's going to happen then? But although Graham and other people, don't want that misery to exist in the world, Ostrog says that it has to be there, even though it very well doesn't. And so Ostrog will never finish this revolution. And that's a big part of what Wells is saying here, is this revolution needs to be finished. It is not simply enough to do the revolution. You have to finish the job. You have to make sure that the socialist utopia that everyone dreams about has actually taken place. Otherwise, you could just end up just exchanging the keys, as I mentioned before, not actually ensuring that this takes place, and the monarchy kind of resuming business as usual there. But related to the monarchy, at least a couple of characters, especially Ostrog, acknowledge that that this changing of power into people who are still nefarious is kind of all all there really is. The monarchy is inevitable. Ostrog says, if the people take him out, some other body will come into power, and they will rule over the people in the same way. And this is just all heading towards an aristocracy. Is that actually the case? I don't think Wells is arguing for that. I think that's just the justification that those in power, that those who favor, the capitalist state or those who favor authoritarian governments, I think they make those arguments that the people can never be trusted to rule themselves. But as Graham says, why does it have to be like that? Can't we try literally anything else? If things are miserable now, let's do something else. Let's try this socialist utopia, and if it doesn't work out, we can try something else down the road. It doesn't have to be miserable for everyone, and I feel like that's a very good point that Wells is making here. And then the last thing related to that is the idea that we can't wait. There's a point where Graham notes that people were working towards the socialist utopia back in his own time in the late 1800s, but it appears that this didn't take place. It just kept getting postponed and postponed and postponed for hundreds of years until you end up 200 years later with the council having this terrible rule, and then Ostrog doing his own terrible thing. And there's this sense that, at least when it comes to socialist utopias or whatnot, when it comes to socialist revolution, that the next generation will be the one to implement this stuff, that our hard work will lead towards that. But I think what Wells is arguing, and because Graham even argues that himself, I think what he's saying is that it's not enough to wait for it to happen. It's not enough to say the next generation will save us. It's not enough to hope that other people will handle the situation differently. You have to be a part of the change that fights, capitalism, fights the bosses, fights the corruption and the terrible authorities in order to facilitate this socialist utopia or this communist utopia or this anarchic utopia or whatever we prefer to call it. To go to this place where everyone has their needs fulfilled and no one is suffering. We must facilitate that. We must work for that to happen. You must work for that to happen. Graham is kind of a stand-in for you in this story. And so if you wait for that to happen, it's never going to happen. People like Ostrog will take control and force the revolution to go in his own direction. And the lower classes, like the true proletariat, will never get what they want. And I think in some ways that makes Wells's message very similar to a story that would come almost 100 years later, and that's 1984. So a lot of similarities between those stories, and both kind of negative because the revolution seems to fail in both of those stories. There's a couple different things that I don't really like about this story. In particular, Graham seems like an ineffective protagonist. He just kind of wanders around, doesn't really have that much much to play in the story, and then at the very end, he tries to shoot down Ostrog, but he himself is shot down, and it appears that he's going to die. He doesn't really play a large role in his own story, but I do think that might be some of the point in that. People like Graham, they might be viewed as messiah figures or whatnot, but they're not incapable of failing. And so it's up to us, everyone involved, to continue on with his revolution and hope that it reaches the place where it needs to be. Otherwise, men like Ostrog will continue to rule with an iron fist and make things even worse for everyone. So, in a way, I kind of understand how he's written, but it also feels like he's just a bystander in his own story. And then there's also the deep-seated racism in the story, which you would expect to find in a story from the 1800s. But one of the problems is that in other stories, it's kind of ignorable, that you can just push it to the side and pretend like it's not there. But here, it's kind of blatantly obvious, because one of the key plot points is that Ostrog is bringing in black police officers. He specifically says the N-word, which Graham takes offense to, because that means that those black police officers are going to be given some level of power and authority over the white workers, which the implication is that people of color should not be on the top or above other white people. And so that's like an entire plot point that it just makes me uncomfortable as I'm reading this, and I'm sure it makes other people uncomfortable, but it kind of brings down the story a lot and makes it hard to really get through. And I feel like I just wonder why H.G. Wells chose to write it like that. It's a facet of the past that doesn't quite hold up in the in the present, like 100 years later. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Sleeper Awakes by H.G. Wells. It is an okay book. I feel like it was going in a really positive direction until it just gets to that the racist kind of ending there. So not as, it doesn't really stand the test of time. Also, I feel like it's very philosophical in that it's more focused on the socialist messaging and the sort of the idea that you have to be the one to facilitate changes. You can't merely wait for someone like the sleeper to show up or something like that. So like I do think that's an aspect of it that's worth reading. Maybe check this out from your local library, but perhaps this is maybe something to avoid because of the racism and whatnot. I'll leave that up to you. If you have anything to say about my review here, do so below. Would love to have a conversation with you about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they do not already know. Also, join the Discord where we can talk more about books and movies and whatnot. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and sleeping travels. Farewell.